big hello and a very warm welcome to Brand Equity with me, Sonali Krishna. Today we focus on the advertising sector, a barometer of economic health and consumer confidence. WARC, which is the World Advertising Research Center, has just released its Q1 forecast update for global advertising spends in 2025 and 26, offering a comprehensive analysis based on data from 100 markets and over 2 million data points. The report highlights both opportunities and challenges, including downgraded growth forecasts, risks of stagflation and regulatory pressures on major tech platforms. Joining us to unpack these findings is James McDonald, Director of Intelligence WARC, and together we will dive deep into what this means for businesses, advertisers, and the global economy. Well, thank you so much for joining us, James, right here from London. How's the weather today?
It's actually uncharacteristically sunny today in London, so you picked a good day to speak to me.
Oh, good for you. I'm so happy that you finally get some sun. Well, here we're burning because summer's come rather early. But apart from, of course, speaking about the weather, the thunderstorms that are surrounding the advertising sector seem rather gloomy. So I want to start with first you giving us a brief overview of WARC's Q1 forecast update, which you've just released, and what, in your view, are the key takeaways?
Our latest forecast shows that the global ad market is set to grow by 6.7% this year to a total value of $1.2 trillion. Now, that on the surface doesn't sound too bad, but in context, we've actually cut our growth forecast by almost 1 percentage point since November. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, in the last 3 months, there has been an increased amount of volatility brought into the trading environment, not least from an introduction of trade tariffs, which I think are being further announced as we speak right now. Beyond that, there are regulatory headwinds for platforms like TikTok and Google and Apple. And finally, there is weak business and consumer demand at the moment, which is also weighing down on advertising budgets. So there is a cocktail of headwinds and challenges that the industry faces. However, 6.7% growth is still expected for the market at large.
Right. So, you've clearly mentioned 3 scenarios, which also the report mentions on varying severities of market deterioration. My question is, can you, for my understanding as well as for my audience, give me a sense of, what these 3 scenarios actually imply for businesses at large?
Of course. So the situation is changing dramatically at the moment, quite rapidly, almost akin to the COVID outbreak. In order to best understand what the future could look like with things changing so rapidly, we have modeled 3 different scenarios for this edition of the forecast. So the first is the base case, which I've just explained, which is 6.7% growth to 1.2 trillion. The second scenario is based on an OECD model, which predicts 10% tariffs being applied across the board. And the impact that would have on OECD economies is the removal of 0.5 point from GDP, as well as the addition of 0.4 percentage points on inflation. In layman's terms, trading conditions will be much more difficult. We factored that OECD scenario into our advertising model and found that dampens growth closer to 6.3%, so removes about 0.5 point from ad growth. We've then gone further and applied a more severe case, which assumes 20% tariffs across the board. This would in turn hit GDP in key markets by 1 percentage point and would have the same impact on inflation. If we were to apply this scenario to the advertising market, we would find that ad growth would weaken to about 5.8%, 5.9%. And actually, that scenario seems to be one of the most likely outcomes based on recent developments.
What also kind of hits you straight up is the fact that you've talked about advertising spend growth being downgraded by $19.8 billion this year and next. Give me a sense of what your primary factors are for driving this downgrade.
Sure. So the aforementioned tariffs are definitely going to play a big part in this. They will impact all brands and all product sectors, we believe, as trading becomes more difficult and margins tighten. But certain big spending sectors like retail, pharmaceutical and automotive are particularly exposed to the increase in tariffs. So that's one underlying factor within our current forecast. The second is uncertainty brought around by regulatory pressures on platforms like TikTok in the US. Obviously, there is an imminent ban, as well as antitrust cases against Google, who potentially have a monopoly in the US market. So all of this is adding to the hesitancy for media planners and strategists when they're committing ad budgets. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, weak consumer demand. I don't know how things are in India at the moment, but in the UK, consumers are heavily squeezed at the moment by high inflation, and that is carrying over. And a downturn in the global economy will bear further pressure on consumers, which ultimately means they'll be buying products less, and that obviously translates into the advertising market.
No, absolutely. I think the situation is similar in India, where consumers are feeling very squeezed. There's a lot of downtrading happening. So pretty similar, I think, globally, with inflation being the biggest demon that we need to counter. But despite the challenges, global ad spend is still expected to grow by 6.7% this year. I believe that's what the report says, to about $1.5 trillion. How does this compare historically to previous years?
Yeah, so that is objectively healthy growth. 6.7% in the market is very nice to see. But the advertising market has been expanding rapidly in the last 5 and 10 years. So the current growth rate is actually behind the 5-year compound annual growth rate recorded in the global ad market. That was 7.6%. And the 10-year growth rate is actually closer to 10%. There are a number of reasons for that, not least a massive boom in online advertising, particularly after the pandemic. And particularly within retail media, which is really fueling the market, as well as social media, which accounts for a quarter of all advertising. That sector is benefiting from new AI tools, which are helping advertisers commit budgets, optimize their budgets, and create stronger creative. So there has been a real boom in the ad market in recent years, and while that 6.7% growth seems good in isolation, actually in context it's quite soft.
Just to talk about specific sectors and, sectors which are basically kind of most exposed to all the factors that you've just talked about. Your report talks about sectors like automotive, retail, and technology, which are, basically much more exposed in terms of being squeezed. Can you explain to me why you see, is it only limited to these sectors? And if not, what are the other sectors which will also see a tough road ahead? And, what in your view needs to be done to kind of balance that so that, the exposure is limited?
WARC monitors 19 major product sectors. And within these, we believe that the impact of tariffs will be felt, to varying degrees across all of these sectors. But to call out a few that will be most exposed, as you say, automotive is obviously a big one. So some of the tariffs that are being introduced are specifically targeting the automotive sector, particularly in countries like China, but also in Mexico and Canada. So the way these tariffs may filter through is the increase in manufacturing costs. So, for example, if aluminium is more expensive, if steel is more expensive, if semiconductors are more expensive, all of these things are crucial to the manufacturing process of automobiles. And actually, in recent years, we've already been seeing major automotive manufacturers like Ford and General Motors decreasing the amount that they spend on advertising in proportion to what they make from selling cars. So that was already a trend that was being observed, but these additional pressures are likely to bear down on advertising budgets even more. So we actually think that advertising spend within the automotive sector will drop by about 7% this year, which is not unsubstantial. Elsewhere, the retail sector is the largest one that we monitor. It's very broad, so it measures like grocery stores, online retailers. But here there is risk too. Big US companies like Amazon, Costco, and Walmart are all heavily dependent on Chinese suppliers in their supply chain. So if there are any new barriers to trade from Chinese suppliers, that stands to disproportionately affect retailers. So even the big giants are not, insulated from all of this. And last but not least, the tech and electronics sector, which had a bit of a recovery last year after slowing growth. We believe that sector will grow again this year, but we think that growth rate will be half what we previously expected. And again, that's a direct result of these tariffs being introduced, making trading and manufacturing more difficult.
Right. Now, if you could just simplify these trade tariffs for me, right? And I believe these trade tariffs are going to take effect in H2 of 2025 and have, of course, been flagged as a significant risk. Could you explain, its potential impact on different economies? For example, just asking as a layperson, if, let's say, American goods available in the country will now be significantly cheaper because of some of that tariffs being lifted, isn't it advantage Indian consumer?
Potentially, making sense of this is a multi-billion-dollar question. But really, the economy is so heavily intertwined. Everything is connected. So one measure of disruption here will have ripple effects elsewhere in the economy. So in layman's terms, the assumption that we're making that underlies our forecast is that tariffs, i.e. higher cost to imports, will ultimately lead to higher costs for consumers.
James, if I could just ask you a question right here. Isn't that a very simplistic way to look at global economies? I'm saying because regions that are manufacturing heavy, regions like China, possibly India, as opposed to, let's say, economies that are not that heavy on manufacturing, the impact on such economies will be much more adverse than it would be, let's say, in a country like China or India, which manufactures a lot of its domestic needs.
You're absolutely right. For countries like India and China, where manufacturing is the backbone of the economy, there are potential benefits for domestic markets. It's when those goods are being exported externally that the pressures could be felt. China accounts for a large part of the automotive market internationally. It is the largest single producer of automotives. So those brands' inability to sell those cars outside of China severely impact underlying margins and profit margins, regardless of domestic demand, which incidentally is quite weak in China by historic standards. So while you're right to say that manufacturers stand to benefit in their domestic market, any gains there are potentially offset by losses from exports.
But would you say this would have a more adverse impact on, let's say, consumers in the US and even in Europe possibly because they don't manufacture as much as opposed to developing countries?
Well, certainly, in fact, the markets that are net importers of goods will feel this more than markets that aren't.
So would you say then it would be advantage India and China?
Yes, there are advantages available to markets like India and China. So brands that navigate this space can find opportunities here by increased domestic demand. But I do also feel that pressures on exports will ultimately have a net negative impact on these businesses.
Just moving on to regulatory pressures, and they're mounting against players like Google, Apple, and TikTok, both in the US, EU, and I might add in India as well. How might these legal battles reshape the advertising landscape?
I mean, the short answer is probably not very much at all. These players are now interwoven into the fabric of advertising. Part of the reason for the big boom in the market that I spoke to earlier in recent years is because of the brokerage of data and using data to underpin advertising. So all of the underlying data really is the fabric of advertising, as I say, and these companies have made billions from targeting ads, leveraging that data. So while regulatory pressures are heating up, I can't foresee these impacts having a huge redrawing of the ecosystem.
It's interesting you say that. So obviously it remains in the digital pie and there's no spillage to traditional. Having said that, don't you think the digital behemoths have had a very long run, without any kind of monitoring or any kind of explanation for not having a unified metric system? All traditional media have been forced, to have metric systems which are common. But since they're so big and there is no other option, and advertisers are kind of invested with the reach that they proclaim they have, the efficacy is still suspect.
It's true that online platforms are not measured in the same way that legacy media are. And it's true also that in some cases, the metrics that these platforms have given have been proven to be false. That was a very big story in recent years. I think the interesting thing is that what we see at WARC is there is an increasing ask on us to understand how advertising budgets work across the media landscape. It's very rare that that a brand would put on a campaign just on TV, for example. There are different touch points. That TV campaign would be supported by search results when we go to look at the product. It would be supported by social media influencers, maybe, and then it would certainly be supported by retail media ads when we go to the store to buy it. So it's an ecosystem, and pinpointing that efficacy and that attribution to different channels is very, very difficult in a fragmented media landscape. So actually holding these companies to similar standards, or at least metrics that are universal, that can be compared across platforms, is to the benefit of advertisers, and I'd argue to these platforms as well, because it helps to make that picture clearer. It helps to show how effective they are in that path to purchase. So I hope we do get there one day.
But why is it taking so long? I mean, I know for the longest time, large advertisers such as Procter and Gamble and, of course, Mark Pritchard, they're, taking on that cause along and lobbying with other advertisers to demand more transparency from the digital payments. It's been an ongoing conversation for several years, but obviously it doesn't make sense for Meta or for Google or for TikTok to actually reveal the data. So as long as they're getting business, they're fine. So why is it taking the advertisers so long to get together and have a united spirit to kind of ask for accountability?
Well, it could be like herding cats in some cases, getting a coalition of advertisers together to have a unified voice in this area can be difficult. And it's not without its risk. I mean, this is an extreme example, obviously, but Elon Musk and Twitter were recently berating the World Federation of Advertisers for their initiative to do just this. So it's a difficult landscape to navigate. I think where it will be felt most is in committed budgets. So these advertisers can kind of, not vote with their feet, but vote with their dollars. And if they're seeing positive net impact from advertising on these social channels, then great, they're probably going to continue. But if they are really questioning it and serious about doing that, then having those serious sober conversations around budgets are the way to progress it, I think.
James, if I asked you to jog your memory, and you've been critiquing and observing this industry for a while, can you name me one brand that has been created solely via social media or digital platforms and completely absent on legacy media?
I can't name one. You put me on the spot there, but there will be
No,
millions.
I mean, I'm sure there are, but I'm saying in your memory, like I can't think of one. So I'm asking you, can you think of one?
Advertising has become very accessible for small and medium-sized enterprises, and that's part of the reason why companies like Meta have grown so rapidly over the last 10 years.
Sure, absolutely.
Whereas we may not be able to afford a TV campaign for our bakery. So there are millions of small and medium-sized enterprises who have solely come to trade on the back of social media advertising that wouldn't necessarily be using legacy media. But larger brands, big brands, your Unilevers, your Procter and Gambles, will always have a media mix, and that's because it's effective.
Right. With the three companies, Meta, Amazon, Alphabet, all accounting for a large share of the digital pie, do you foresee any shift in market dynamics due to the regulatory interventions?
Nothing lasts forever. So there will be a disruptor in this space at some point. I can't tell you who that is. If I knew, we'd all be very rich because we'd back them, right? We buy the shares. But there will be disruption in this market. The tech sector depends on it to innovate and to move forward. I mean, already we're seeing, core search business like Google, core searches through a search engine, traffic falling in some cases because people aren't searching through Google in the way they used to. They're using AI more, or they're going directly to e-commerce sites, or they're looking through social media. So people's path to purchase is changing and evolving, and companies will emerge on the back of that we never thought could possibly be.
There's so much talk about data, and everybody has data, but how do you think the art of data mining has evolved over the years? Because everybody talks of data, everybody has the data, but what are you doing with the data is the question, isn't it? And I don't know, at least in India, and you can give me the perspective from your country, I think they have just no clue. I mean, I would hold a credit card and I will still get a call asking if I want a credit card, although I'm a holder of a credit card of that particular company, with absolutely no data mining in place. So what's the point of all this data, James?
Great question. And what you've described is true universally, I think. Marketers are still trying to understand how to harness the full power of all of the data that has been collected. Ultimately, the purpose of collating this data is not to creep people out, it's not to annoy people, the advertisers will argue, it's to make sure that the advertising that they serve you is more effective and more relevant to what you're interested in. But I think in practice, applying the data that has been collated is still very hit and miss, because it needs to be done effectively at scale. And doing anything effectively at scale is very, very tricky. And again, without wishing to sound like a broken record, part of the reason why companies like Meta and Google have done so well is because they have been able to harness this data more effectively than other entities.
Sure, sure. Moving to, a topic that is very close to everybody's heart, and it is the flavor of the season, which is AI. How do you see AI shaping advertising strategies, especially, of course, in digital channels?
Yeah, so AI is big for our industry at the moment, as it is for most industries, as I'm sure you'd imagine. Companies like Meta are already leveraging AI in its ad selling process. So this manifests in a couple of ways. A typical example would be to use AI to optimize advertising placement. So the advertiser doesn't have to choose, they just select the audience they want, and the AI will place that ad in the most optimal position.
But James, that was always prevalent with programmatic, right? What was programmatic?
Certainly, yes, but the AI can learn from those programmatic bids and optimize it further.
But James, there's been a debate about programmatic placement as well, because there's brand safety concerns, the fact that they're all over the place. I can give you several examples of how brands are appearing in porn sites, right, which I don't know if they really want to appear there, and if they're looking to target a customer who's watching pornography, but that's happening. So I mean, are you suggesting AI is a more effective tool and is more advanced, that it can it can reduce all of this spillage that is happening via programmatic?
It has the potential to, but it's not a panacea. It won't cure everything in that regard. And you're absolutely right. Negative adjacency, ad fraud have blighted programmatic advertising for a long time. So AI has the power to mitigate some of those risks.
Sure. James, are there any notable regional differences in how ad spend is being projected to grow or decline?
Yes, the regional picture is varied at the moment. So, for example, in Europe, growth is quite sluggish. Key economies like Germany, for example, are skirting with recession. There is stagflation in the UK as well. So growth is more muted in Europe. In North America, the prospects are okay, growth around 6%. There is a FIFA World Cup across North America next year, which should also help with spend, particularly around TV and out-of-home billboards, etc. So that should lift North American spending. Asia is also growing well. India in particular, 10% this year. So really fast growth in India by regional standards. However, to counteract that, growth in China is a lot slower, so closer to 5%. So the picture is myriad, and I think there's a danger when we talk in global terms to miss the domestic nuance. So WARC makes those considerations for 100 different markets.
Looking ahead to 2026, how optimistic is WARC about sustained growth in the global advertising spend?
Yep, so we're expecting a further rise of 6.3% next year. So that compares to the 6.7% we were expecting this year. Again, not bad, but behind long-term growth. And much of that headline rate will be lifted by the World Cup next year. the growth rate is slowing next year compared to this year. And again, that's because we feel that the impacts of the economic volatility that are being felt from the second half of this year will resonate into 2026.
What advice would you give advertisers navigating these rather uncertain times while planning for their budgets for 25-26?
My advice would be bold. It's very easy, and we've seen this countless times over the 4 decades of monitoring that the WARC has maintained. In times of economic hardship, businesses often look to cut advertising budgets as a first port of call. It's seen as an expense which can be perceived as a luxury inside a business and not a necessity. And all of the evidence we've seen suggests that that is the wrong move. It has negative long-term impacts if you go dark during a recession or an economic downturn. The brands that actually spend a bit more are the ones that gain share of voice and gain market share as a result. So my advice is be bold. Fight back on your CFO, make the case for your advertising budgets, and outfox your competitors as a result.
True, yeah. Are there any emerging sectors or trends that advertisers should keep an eye on for future opportunities?
Consumer packaged goods is not an emerging sector,
For sure.
but there are lots of emerging brands within that sector and a lot of innovation. Consumers are always going to want goods given to them in an easily accessible format that you don't have to think too much about. So how that space is evolving is very interesting, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think that ethos carries across to most sectors. The brands that do well are the ones that are innovating.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for your time, James. This has been very insightful.
Thank you.